There are two chapters in the Bible that are devoted almost entirely to the topic of love. John and Paul have very different writing styles. One of these love chapters is from the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And the other love chapter is the fourth chapter of 1 John. As we read these things, we get a sort of a thrust of what the author really is where he's coming from. And so Paul deals primarily in love as it relates to us and our relationships with other people. Love as it guides us in the everyday walks of life. Now, John, on the other hand, deals with the same topic, but he deals with it in a much different way. John, for example, talks about God loving us and consequently us loving God. And yet then he, in a very beautiful way, he transforms the power of God's love in us to the capability of you and I learning to love each other. And so he talks about this very thing of love one another. There's a story told about John that is probably apocryphal, but nevertheless it was kind of a traditional thing. I can almost say a mythological thing that arose in the early 2nd century. And the story goes like this. John, by the way, in his later years, was living in Ephesus. And we're pretty sure of that. Not from apocryphal sources, but from other sources. And he lived to be about 95 years old. And by that time, he was a very feeble man, and he was not able to get around very much. But one day, he appeared at the assembly of the church, and they were all so glad to see him. And they said, "John, do you have some message for the church today?" And John, in his feeble way, he got before the congregation and he said, "Love one another. Love one another. Love one another." He said it 3 times, and then he sat down. It's kind of interesting the way the story goes, because some people said, John still knows the essence of the gospel. And other people who kind of didn't know John's background and all, they said, well, poor John, he's losing it. He's losing it. Well, John was not really losing it, but it does say something about the impact of the writings of this great man, John. And so what I want to do tonight, it's going to be primarily just reading and a little bit of commenting on the passages in 1 Corinthians 13 and over in 1 John chapter 4. So let me read this whole passage in 1 John chapter 4, beginning with verse 7. "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, so also ought we to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. We know that we live in him, and he lives in us, because he has given us of his Spirit. And we have seen and testified that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. If anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in him, and he in God. And so we know and rely on the love that God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God lives in him. In this way, love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence in the day of judgment, because in this world we are like him. And this is a great, wonderful way for him to end this particular thought. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, yet he hates his brother, he's a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. And he has given us this command: whoever loves God must also love his brother. That is just a great, great statement, isn't it? It's a great portion of this wonderful chapter. Let's pause for a moment now and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and take a look at what Paul says in reference to this same topic of love. 1 Corinthians 13 is many times is called the love chapter of the Bible. Let me mention a little bit of the background of 1 Corinthians 13. The church in Corinth was having a terrible time. They were at odds with each other. There was division in the church. There was a great lack of love in the church. And they had certain spiritual gifts that they were practicing, and some had this gift and some had another gift. And, well, my gift is bigger than your gift. My gift is more important than your gift. And there was a lot of competition going on in all of this. And so in the 12th, 13th, and 14th chapters of 1 Corinthians, Paul deals with this. We're right in the middle of dealing with the conflicts that were there, the conflicts about spiritual gifts and who's the most important and all this sort of thing. Right in the midst of that, John says this: eagerly desire the greater gifts, and now I will show you a more excellent way. That's the way he ends chapter 12. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong and a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that I can remove mountains, but have not love, I'm nothing. If I give all my possessions to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices in the truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. Always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. And where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it'll be done away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when perfection comes, the imperfect will disappear. When I was a child, I talked as a child, I thought as a child, I reasoned as a child. When I became a man, I put childish things away. Now we see but a poor reflection in the mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now the great thing that he says to end it. Now, these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Do you see the contrast? Or maybe I ought not to use the word contrast. Do we see the difference, though, in the styles of these two writers and what they're trying to present to us? Let's go back to John, 1 John chapter 4 for just a moment now, and we'll take a look through this and just, we'll kind of cherry pick some of these things and see what they really look like. The 7th verse again, he says, let us love one another, for love comes from God, and everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Remember that this letter was written toward the end of the 1st century. This letter was written to Christian people, telling them this is the way to live. How can I test my love for God? Basically, he says, the way I test my love for God is by seeing about my love for people. Oh, I know exactly how to criticize people. I know exactly how to tell what their weaknesses are. I can tell you just exactly about the evils of their lives, the sins of their lives, and all this sort of thing. I can fill you in on a lot of those things. Now, isn't that kind of the way we are sometimes? John says, though, that the test of fidelity, the test of really our relationship to God is how we learn to love. And so he says, dear friends, let's love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God, and he knows God. I've been introduced to a very few, but a few important people. They call my name, I called their name. How are you today? Fine. Nice to meet you. Goodbye. They don't remember me, I don't remember them. But you see, in the Christian context of things, the Christian context says that our relationship to other human beings needs to be one of love and really knowing those people. It isn't just a matter of saying, hello, how are you at church this morning or this evening either. It's learning to know one another. And that's what helps us to love each other. Let me give you, if you don't mind, I'll try to use a personal example here. My wife and I, we grew up in the same Church of Christ down in Miami, Florida. We knew each other. Her name was Betty. My name was Jack. She knew that, and I knew that. I thought she was a little kind of funny looking, to tell you the truth. She turned out to be a very pretty girl, but I didn't know her. I didn't know her very well. I knew her name. We had gatherings together in their home and in our home, church gatherings and all that, but I never paid any attention to her. And then one day, after the Second World War, when I came home, my folks said, my brother-in-law said, Jack, you ought to take a look at Betty Patton. Let's see, when I left to go away to the service, Betty Patton was 14 years old. I was 18. You know, that doesn't work. She was almost 15. But that just didn't work. I'm not interested in Betty Patton. Well, one Wednesday night just before Thanksgiving, in walked Betty Patton with the family. She had just come in from college for Thanksgiving. And, when we're sitting in a class in church, somebody comes in late, what do? We got to turn around and see who that was, And so I was sitting with my brother, and I turned around and I saw Betty Patton, and I said, "Oh me," "Oh me." She is now 19, and I'm 21. That's not bad at all, is it? We got to know each other. We began dating. We fell madly in love with each other, and we married. And we had the greatest marriage in the history of the whole world. What took place? We came to know each other. We came to love each other because we were growing closer and closer together. In human relationships, when we find out more about the other person, his strengths, his weaknesses, his problems, his joys, his family, his work, and all of these things, we get to know them a little better, and we get to appreciate them. And we don't criticize them quite so much for their weaknesses, because we realize that, hey, some of his weaknesses are some of my weaknesses too. Some of his faults really are some of my faults too. And there grows in our hearts and minds, there grows and knits together the personalities of two people, and they come to love each other. And so John says, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed us his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. Well, what's he talking about? He's talking about love exemplified. Love exemplified is the strongest communicator of love that any of us can ever imagine. We can speak the words. We can say we love. We can tell people we love, but it isn't until love manifests itself in some way of service, of of humility. It isn't until love manifests itself that we communicate the real meaning of love. And so what does John do? Well, John, in a beautiful, wonderful way, John says, God showed us his love. How did he do that? He showed us his love by sending his Son. When my children were growing up, and this is still true for that matter, but as they were growing up, I protected them in every way that I felt like I could. Keep them out of danger, hold their hand crossing the street so they wouldn't run out ahead of me and get hit by a car. And I protected them as they did that. And so John shows us God is with us, protecting us. Why? Because God loves us. And so that's the kind of love that God has shown us. That's the kind of love that transforms itself into human relationships. Once we learn the real love of God, we can learn to love each other. And then he says, we love because he first loved us. I wish that Joe Alessandro could be here, because one of his favorite songs in the whole book has to do with that fact. I love the Lord because he first loved us. So the more we study, the more we learn, the more we experience the love of God, the better equipped we are to love other people. Now, I'm a critical person. I see things that are wrong, I criticize those things. And I had to be beaten in the head every once in a while to keep from doing that sort of thing. I remember Betty said, Jack, don't criticize things. Don't criticize people. Well, that was hard, and it is hard for me to learn. I'm still in the first grade on that, I think. I'm still trying to learn that. Now, perfect love, though, tempers that criticism. So instead of criticizing to say, you are guilty, you flubbed it up on this, you did the wrong thing, you hurt me, you hurt somebody else. Instead of that, it's an effort to bring that person into a closer relationship. And criticism then takes on itself a constructive character. Why? Because it's acting out of love, not out of vengeance. Now, one of my favorite statements, though, is found right down here toward the end of this chapter. In the 18th verse, he says, "There is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear." I've known people who live lives of fear. And probably all of us have known people like that. They operate out of fear. I'm so afraid this will happen that I do so-and-so. I'm so afraid that this will fall. I'm so afraid that this person will do that, and that will destroy things, and it will harm and hurt things. No, yeah, we ought to be aware of dangers. That's certainly true. But some people, their lives are characterized by reaction rather than proaction. Their lives are characterized by being afraid rather than being problem solvers and people who are aggressively trying to grow in love. And so John says, there is no fear in love. When Jesus Christ went to the cross, he faced the cross boldly, bravely. Why? Because the Bible doesn't say this, but I think the implication is very strong. All along the way, he knew he was doing this because he loved the people. Because he loved every person, the most terrible sinner, the most terrible terrorist, the most terrible individual we can comprehend. Christ died for that person. Why? Because he loved that person. I love this statement. I quote it so many times in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, 22, where Paul says, the life that I now live in the flesh, I live to the glory of the Son of God. And listen to this, who loved me and gave himself up for me. He didn't say who loved the world, although that's true. He didn't say he gave himself up to the world, but that's true. But it was so personal to Paul, it was so intimate to him, that he says he loved me and gave himself up for me. So love, perfect love, John says, takes fear out of one's life. Perfect love casts out fear. Let's turn now to 1 Corinthians 13 and see what Paul says about this same topic. Actually, we want to begin with the 8th verse, because this is where Paul gives his description of love. This is really not a definition. There is no way that we can define love, but it certainly is a description of how love acts, how love behaves itself. So let's just take the words that are used here and notice them closely as we conclude this whole idea of how Paul speaks of love in reference to personal relationships. And so he says, beginning with I said the 8th verse, let's begin with the 4th verse. Love is patient. Love is kind. Wouldn't it be a wonderful world that we live in if everybody practiced patience with everybody else? Oh, when things don't go the way I want them to, I lose patience with people. It just aggravates me that that person didn't do what he was supposed to do. That person didn't do what was needed. That person did something that was that reflected badly. I just lose patience. Well, that's because I don't love as I ought to love. He says, love is patient. And I don't know that this is designed this way, but it seems to me that they fit. Patient people have a tendency to be kind people. And so he says, love is patient, love is kind. Love doesn't envy. What is envy? Envy and jealousy are two words that almost always go together. Adam Clarke, in his commentary, gave, I guess, the best definition of envy that I've ever read. He said, envy is that disturbed feeling that a person has at the excellence of someone else. I thought that was so good. I don't want him to be more excellent than I am. I don't want him to be better looking. This is bad. I don't want him to be better looking than I am. I don't want him to be more skilled than I am. I want him to be below me in some things. And so this is jealousy, envy. I all the time, my jealousy is really saying, I wish I could be like him. I wish I could be as good as he is. I wish I could be as skillful as he is. I wish I could be as effective as he is. And so jealousy has a way of turning on us. When we are jealous of other people, we don't really damage the other person so much. We damage ourselves in this whole thing. So he says, love is patient, kind, it doesn't envy, it doesn't boast. I think probably all of us kind of detest the idea of a person who is always talking about himself. I was in a seminar one time, and there was a man who was he was a real estate exchanger, and he did a lot of real estate counseling. And in counseling, whether it's for real estate or other businesses or psychological counseling, listening is very, very important. And so he was sitting next to a man, and this fellow was the featured speaker that I'm talking about here, but he was sitting next to a fellow, and during the dinner, they were carrying on conversation and all of this, and this man, his name was Royce Ringsdorf, and I knew him, and he was listening. He got up to make his speech, and his speech was going to be on effective counseling. And he got up to make his speech, and he said, I want to tell you something about, and he called the man's name, and he went on and told a whole lot about that person. And then he turned to the person and he said, can you tell this audience anything about me? And he thought, he said, no, I really can't, except what's in the program. And Royce Ringsdorf used that to show that so much of the time, and instead of thinking about myself, boasting about myself, when I listen to other people, I found out something that I can hold to, I can cling to. And that person eventually is going to find out anything he needs about me. But the idea is we need to learn to be listening people. And that's really a big part of boasting. We don't talk about ourselves, our accomplishments and all of these things. No, we talk instead about how we can find out about the other person and what the other person is and who he is. And then he goes on and says, love is not proud, it's not rude, it's not self-seeking. Well, those things don't really need very much explanation, do they? Pride goes before destruction, the Bible says. Proud people divorce themselves many times from the run-of-the-mill people because All he's ever talking about is what he's done and how proud he is to be what he is and what he's accomplished and all that sort of thing. Now, there are two sides to this. This isn't the idea that I put myself down. It isn't the idea that I see myself as inferior, but it is the idea that I do not emphasize my accomplishments. Now, the greatest thing I think that we can say about ourselves is not our accomplishments, but it's a simple statement, I am a child of God. That goes back to the sermon last Sunday. I am a child of God. Now, how does a child of God act? How does a child of God speak? How does a child of God manifest his attitude? Well, he doesn't do that by being proud and boastful or rude or self-seeking. Love, you see, demands that I be this kind of person. Negative things that he talks about. It's not easily angered. I will never forget a man who at one time attended the Glendale Church of Christ while I was preaching there, and he and his wife had two children, and he was a very angry person. And he came into the study one day, and he wanted to talk with me, and he just said, Jack, I am so angry. I am angry at everybody about anything or everything or nothing. He says, I can see a man that I've never seen before. I can see him standing on the opposite corner, and I can look at him, and I can wish in my mind I'd like to go just bloody his nose. Well, because he was an angry type of person. How do we overcome that? Paul says we overcome that by practicing love toward people. There's a story that was told many, many years ago about a woman who never criticized anybody. And it was kind of the thing known in this little small town that this woman never said bad things about anybody. Well, there was a very, very evil man who lived in the community. And so some of them said, we will get her this time. And they presented this evil man and said, what can you say about this man? You have the reputation of not criticizing. What can you say about this man? He's evil, he's wicked, he's hated by almost everybody in this city. What can you say about him? And she thought for a minute, and she said, boy, he sure can whistle. You see, when we look for good things in people, lo and behold, we find good things. When we look for things in people to love and to admire, we find those things. And so Paul tells us, not rude, not easily angered, and here it is. He doesn't keep score. He doesn't keep score. Some people can tell you how many times another person has insulted him. Love does not keep score, keeps no records of wrongs. It doesn't delight in evil. Oh boy, that serves him right, doesn't it? He got what was coming to him. If he were not such a terrible man himself, this would never have happened to him. And so, see, I've got it all pegged here. I've got all the bad things that I know that this person has done. Love doesn't do that. Love doesn't delight in evil. Love doesn't keep a record of wrongs. But what? Love rejoices in truth. And then he says, love always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always perseveres. And then the great thing that he says, love never fails. Wow. Love never fails. Most of the time. But not in this situation. Love doesn't mean like. Love means instead, it's a Greek word agape. And love means the idea of desiring the best for another person. It doesn't deal so much with the emotions as it deals with the will. This word agape is a wonderful word, and it is the word that is used more times than any other word in the Greek text that's translated love. You see, the Greeks had 4 words for love. Love of family, love that depends on the will, passionate love, and so forth. There were a number of different things like that. We've got only one word for it. And so we throw it into a hopper. But the word that's used here is a word that says, I am determined. I want the best for this person. I am not talking about liking the person. I'm talking about loving the person. And so this is his idea. Love never fails. And then he goes on and talks about various things that will fail. Let me just mention this to you as we close. This life is not going to remain forever. What we have done for love in our lives will live on. How are people going to remember you, remember me, when my time on earth is all over? Jack Burch was a person who never forgot an injury that was done to him. He kept a list of everybody who had ever done anything bad. He knew exactly what they had done when they did it. He was a jealous person. He was an envious person. He was a person who always tried to get back and retaliate. No, that's not the way I want to be remembered. I don't know how I'll be remembered, but boy, I sure hope it's not that way. We want to be remembered as people of compassion, people of love, people of people who restrain those things that want to come out of us that injure other people. Love controls all of that. And once we learn the depth of love, as John says, that Christ has loved us, the depth of that love, then we have the power from God to transfer that same love into our love for one another. So as I began, let me say again, I think John was right when he was an old man and he stood up before that little audience in Ephesus and they said, John, do you have a message for us? And his message was, love one another. Love one another. Love one another.